Welcome to Hickory Street Podcast. I'm going to be doing a kind of a different solo episode here. This episode is going to be about the misconception that sort of happens around Thanksgiving about Native American history. And this is also going to be a little bit about what kind of went on in my experiences in college and some of the bad professors that I had. So I really just kind of want to focus in on Native American history because Thanksgiving is a time where I personally see a lot of negative connotations around Thanksgiving towards, Native American history, but a lot of people don't understand how nuanced Native American history actually is. And there's a very small portion of Native American history that I kind of notice that people cite for their reasons of disliking, the holiday of Thanksgiving. And Thanksgiving is my favorite holiday. And so it just kind of sucks to see there's like a lot of negative connotations with it. But, so let's start at the beginning. I'm obviously going to give a quick synopsis of some history you've probably already been made aware of, but I'm going to be citing two separate books that I've read, and then also just going to be kind of pulling knowledge from my past studies. I'm not doing this like with a book in front of me. This is all from memory, so I'm going to keep the things that I talk about somewhat vague. I'm not going to talk too much about like specific years or dates. I might give like a date range. It's typically how I kind of refer to some of the things that I'm talking about in history, just in conversation. And I don't want this to feel like I'm giving this, academic lecture, because that's really not what I'm doing. I'm just trying to get people to think about things a little bit differently. So, and I'll have to apologize. I need to drink some water. I did vocals yesterday for our album, and my voice is really sore. Okay, so one of the books that I'm going to be citing is called Lone Star. It's like 800 or 900 pages, something like that. And it was written in the 50s by an historian who was somewhat well known. He's actually a Texas historian from Texas, obviously, and it's just like an entire history of Texas in general. And it kind of goes into some of the more detailed accounts of the Spanish settlers. And I think it'll be important to kind of note some of those things from that book. And the other book I'm going to be citing from is going to be a book called Jackson Land, and it's about Andrew Jackson. And you'll have to just read the Jackson Land book, but it was actually written by a journalist. Wasn't written by a historian, so he takes kind of a more interesting approach to the history of Andrew Jackson because he's sort of out of the historical thought bubble. So he was, I think he was a journalist. I can't remember the guy's name, but I think he was a journalist for the New York Times, and he did this this history of Jackson, looking at it from a more legal and journalistic perspective, and obviously he cites historical things that happened, but primarily he's looking at like public documents and legal documents that existed through like the court system. And Jackson has a very interesting backstory and history. So let's go all the way back to 1400s. So Christopher Columbus, as misguided as he might have been, was not necessarily a malicious figure. He kind of thought of himself as sort of the Neil Armstrong of the world. Now you have to kind of put this into context here, but the people's understanding of geography and the world in general was extremely limited because of how slow information got transmitted to and from people. A lot of the times, if you were writing a letter clear across town, it could get lost, and that person may never receive, your message. And during this time period, Spain, in particular, was the dominant military and cultural force. They had the strongest navy. They explored the most territory. A lot of people don't understand this, but it was actually the Spanish that established all of the slave trade routes. And these routes would be used for hundreds of years, and they discovered them. They sailed around Africa. They actually sailed all the way around Africa to get to India, which is what Christopher Columbus was trying to do. And at this time, everybody thought the earth was flat. And so Christopher Columbus, in a lot of his diary entries, you can kind of see that he is he's very ambitious. He's a little egotistical, and he gets rejected a lot for this notion of traveling across the sea to get to India and establishing a quicker route. And what's something that's really interesting about Christopher Columbus that a lot of people don't know, and it just amazes me that a lot of people don't know this about him, but he actually thought himself as a failure for a very long period after he discovered America. And yes, of course, there were other expeditions to America, but nobody had gone there intentionally. A lot of the times that people discovered America before Christopher Columbus was by accident. You got to think about how archaic navigation was at the time. And so a lot of people ended up in the Gulf region of America purely by accident because they were sailing and had a storm, and a lot of their crew would typically die during the storm or just due to disease. Modern medicine was also a really archaic. It was also in a very archaic form, so nobody had remedies other than like teas and oils and like bleeding techniques and stuff like that. So anyways, Christopher Columbus actually tried to propose this idea of sailing to establish a quicker trade route to India probably like 4 or 5 times before the king and queen of Spain finally said yes and gave him the funding that he was asking for. And don't ask me the names of the king and queen of Spain because I don't remember. But It was really, and from what I understand, it was really the queen that was sort of urging for this. I want to say there were a lot of the aristocracy in Spain was against this idea because it seemed like a faulty investment. And they already had established a trade route that they knew was secure to India. So it seemed kind of silly to them to invest all of this money in this extremely large expedition to essentially try to find a quicker way. But, at this time, people saw a lot of opportunity to make a name for themselves in the books of history, in the same way that Christopher Columbus did. And so, Christopher Columbus, we all know, 1492, gets to America and names the Native Americans Indians, thinking he's in India. And for pretty much the rest of his life, he becomes in denial that he didn't reach India. He lives pretty much the rest of his life being told over and over again that he did not get to India, that he discovered a new land, and he just doesn't believe it. And in his diaries, he writes a lot of egotistical, like rants about how, these people don't know what they're talking about. I traveled the sea and all this other stuff, and it's all out there. You can find it, but anyways, so he discovers America, and he goes. I think he makes like 3 or 4 more trips to America. And at this point, Native American tribes in the Gulf region and in kind of like in like closer to like the Florida region, like modern day Florida, in that region, a lot of the Native Americans there in those regions were still fairly migrant. A lot of the tribes were not, and this is partly why it's so difficult to track Native American history, because a lot of it was not preserved due to the fact that a lot of these tribes migrated with their food source, specifically buffalo. There's several tribes that are noted in early Texas history specifically, but really this sort of existed all over America at the time. But they migrated to the seasons. They didn't stay in an area. A lot of the Native Americans that we think of that are sort of the most popular tribes and the most like sophisticated tribes of the time, like the Aztecs and the Incas, that actually built like these pyramid structures. A lot of them were sort of the anomaly. There were so many other tribes that existed that the names of are, kind of lost in history. This book, Lone Star, goes into a lot of the forgotten tribes that existed specifically in Texas, but a lot of them were migrant. So whenever the Spanish came over to America, they brought a lot of diseases with them, which I think everybody is aware of, but what isn't very known about the rate of fatalities for the Native Americans, in terms of disease and smallpox, is that from the late 1400s, early 1500s, all the way until close to like 1700, disease killed about, I want to say, it's close to like 70% of the Native Americans, and that's not an overstatement. That actually could possibly be an understatement. So you got to really think about the regions that were being settled by the Spanish, because the Spanish were the primary settlers of America until about the 1600s. They pretty much owned America until 1600. So for like 100 years, it was like Spain, and by 1600, France had just started to kind of get in the game, but like it was primarily just Spain. And so a lot of the genocide of the Native Americans was unintentional. It was purely through disease, and it makes a lot of sense from an anthropologic perspective, just because in Europe, people live in a lot closer quarters than they did in, a native America, where we had tribes and people were migrant with their food source, whether it be the buffalo or just cattle. A lot of Native Americans primarily, lived off of farming like 2 or 3 particular crops and then eating insects. There were plenty of Native American tribes that were cannibalistic, that sort of ate their own out of a spiritual ritual. There were other Native American tribes that were cannibalistic as a punishment, and sometimes out of necessity, because of how difficult it was to, find food sources and maintain a food source for, their tribe. So it was a very different time, but one thing that kind of gets lost in our understanding of some of the origins of ideas that exist in America, like slavery, is that it originated from the Spanish. It was not an idea propagated by Britain or France even, really. It was an idea solely propagated by Spain. A multitude of Spanish explorers and settlers came to America, came in contact with the Native Americans, and wrote in their diaries very specific things about the way that they were living and their religion. And a lot of these explorers had doctrines from the Spanish royalty, specifically to convert these new people to become Catholic. and that's when monasteries and missions started to exist and try to prop up. But the problem is that growing the crops that existed in Spain was nearly impossible in America. The climate was just too arid and too unpredictable and harsh. Just like really harsh winters and really dry, hot summers. Sometimes humid summers. And the crops that they grew over in Europe they couldn't figure out how to get them to thrive in America. So they sort of saw that a lot of the Native Americans were hunters and specifically hunted the buffalo and cattle, and the Spanish were very interested in and had experience with domesticating animals. They knew how to ride horses. They had these very expensive and new weapons and armors that the Native Americans had absolutely no prior contact with. So they used their technological and their intellectual prowess in domesticating animals and in religion and literacy, because literacy was something very new to Native American tribes in the same way that we understand it today. And they tried to enslave the Native Americans, but the rate at which Native Americans died as a result of disease was something like 75%. So it was like 3 out of every 4 Native Americans that they tried to enslave ended up dying before they could. And as the Spanish Empire began to fall in the 1600s, at that point, Spain had not had a successful settlement, specifically in Texas, until probably like I think it was like the mid 1600s, and it was primarily a result of the cattle drive, because the whole way that the cattle drive in Texas came to be essentially was due to Native American history of following the buffalo and following cattle, other types of cattle that would migrate up north and migrate down south with the seasons, with spring and summer and fall, due to vegetation that was present. And so a lot of these migrant tribes like the Comanche would established cultural dominance, and the Spanish essentially kind of harnessed that in and developed one successful settlement in present day San Antonio, which is San Brazos, is what it was called before it was called San Antonio. And so that's sort of like the Native American history. But then by the time that Andrew Jackson came to be, Andrew Jackson's a really interesting character because he comes from a very uneducated background. It wasn't until he was like 18 or 19 that he started to learn how to read. And then by the time he was 21, he actually got his license to become a lawyer. And he was a soldier in the French and Indian War, if I'm not mistaken. And through that, got like a very, very brutal warrior notoriety amongst his circle and even outside of his circle. And so through that, and learning how to read, he became a lawyer. And through becoming a lawyer, at the end of the French and Indian War, there were these private companies that were interested in purchasing and taking control of land in Canada. And they sort of, because a lot of the settlers in America saw opportunity in expanding into the Canadian region, just because there's a lot of, they saw that there was a lot of land out there, and it was just like one unsuccessful attempt after another unsuccessful attempt. And so flash forward to post revolution, and you know what, I might have that wrong. Someone will probably have to fact check me, but I don't think Andrew Jackson was actually involved in the French and Indian War. I think it was like his grandfather, or like one of his relatives was. Anyways, he got a lot of these. He got a lot of these grants, essentially, by some of these private companies that, these private land companies that popped up post French and Indian War and post American Revolution. And they were specifically designed to explore land and purchase it. And so the majority of land that ended up being settled by European Americans was purchased quasi-legally through Andrew Jackson. It's sort of how he became wealthy and how he got a public name for himself. He would go into these regions and purchase land, and a lot of the Native Americans at this time really liked alcohol. So a lot of it was purchased through the trade of alcohol. And it got so bad that several tribes started to resist it. And so like the chiefs would reject payment of alcohol in exchange for land. And then that caused a lot of internal strife with the tribe. And so there were a lot of chiefs that were actually assassinated by their own ambitious warriors that then became sort of the spokespeople for the tribe, or like the quasi chief of the time, since the chief had been assassinated. And so it kind of became a very chaotic situation. And each time they would draw up this legal agreement and exchange the alcohol for the land, what would end up happening is the tribe would reject the agreement and would often attack the settlers. And most of the time it was purely due to the fact that they didn't understand English and they had no idea what they were really signing. And there were, some Native American tribes that spoke a language that could be interpreted. And a lot of times tribes would sort of designate someone around this time to be an interpreter, and we're talking like mid 1800s now, or close to mid 1800s, or probably like late 1700s, mid 1800s, definitely before like 1850. We're probably talking like 1820, 1830, somewhere around there. But and like maybe even back as far back to like 1810, 1820. I'm just trying to give like a date range. You'll have to like look it up to get some of this exact information, but the book goes into this. So by the time of Andrew Jackson, we already had like 70% of the Native Americans that died unintentionally due to disease, and then the majority of the genocide of Native Americans were done through legal means of these private companies that sort of expanded westward in the name of Manifest Destiny. And it was a very small minority of the population that was actually doing this, and it had everything to do with the private companies that were in, and actually some of them had very public ties to the time, but they had a specific interest in acquiring this land, and Andrew Jackson was essentially the spokesperson for the majority of these companies that had existed like near the Carolinas, and like the Tennessee region. So there became a growing number of court cases, specifically with one tribe. I cannot remember the name of the tribe. It might be the Cherokee. I can't remember exactly. But there was a Native American who actually was literate, understood English, and became a lawyer. And I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But he actually took Andrew Jackson and these companies to court. And unfortunately, he did not win his court case because the majority of these Native American chiefs willingly signed over their land in exchange for alcohol. And there's some speculation as to how many of these agreements were forced. But being interested in history, you kind of just have to look at what the facts are and what actually happened. So a lot of that is speculation. But the majority of the American population from probably like early 1600s to around the time of Andrew Jackson lived relatively peacefully alongside the Native Americans. It wasn't really until the French and Indian War that there were some hostilities, specifically with Britain, because Britain at the time before America was founded as a country, sent the British military to protect the colonies after the French and Indian War. And that was done out of essentially pleas from British ambassadors, essentially, that were sort of in charge of overseeing the colonies that were being developed. And it was really done out of necessity, because at the end of the French and Indian War, it wasn't like, oh, okay, you're going to go back to your area and I'm going to go back to my area, and these new borders that we've drawn, we're just going to respect them. That didn't really happen. Native Americans were not too happy about, losing a lot of their land at the end of the French and Indian War. And culturally, they kind of saw it in the same way as, Russia currently sees Ukraine as like being culturally a part of them, even though it's like a separate region at the end of a war. So the British were sent here to secure the colonies and keep the Native Americans from raiding the territory. So that's sort of the history of the short history of Native Americans in America, and how the Trail of Tears came to be. And it's very tragic, and it's very complicated culturally, and there's a justification that does exist with sort of the scrutiny around Thanksgiving. But the holiday itself, Thanksgiving, was sort of an idealistic holiday, meaning that there was never really one particular time where like Native Americans and early American settlers from Europe sort of actually sat at a table and like exchanged cuisines. But that sort of thing did happen culturally, and there were lots of English American settlers that settled peacefully alongside the Native Americans, but that's sort of lost in American history due to the violent nature of wars and the legal nature of the Native American exodus that was sort of imposed on them. But there's a reason why we value Native American history, and it's something that it actually still exists today in a lot of ways, perhaps not the most helpful of ways sometimes, but a lot of early American settlers learned Native American language and embraced the Native American culture. Over time, it didn't happen overnight, but just like any other complicated society, the racist and the overarching skepticism that existed among most people, specifically like through the early media channels and just word of mouth and just pure ignorance, unfortunately, kind of won out. And so, personally, the way I look at Thanksgiving is it's a way to try to reconcile these things and embrace a culture that we should still value today, despite the tragedies that occurred in our early history. So that's kind of concludes this episode. Hopefully you learned something. If not, hopefully it inspires you to go out and learn something new. But like I said, I did a lot of this off the top of my head, or I really did all of it off the top of my head. I don't have a book in front of me, so I'm sure I got some things wrong or inconsistent or whatever, but I'm just having a conversation with myself, so. All right, bye.